The first blow was a surprise, a dull, shocking thud against his ribs that stole the air from his lungs and sent him stumbling back against the cold, damp brick of the alley wall. The second, a fist to his jaw, was just insult to injury, snapping his head to the side with a crack that echoed in the narrow space. He tasted the coppery tang of blood. "Got anything for us, old man?" The voice was young, laced with a cruel, bored arrogance. It belonged to a shadow with a hyena's laugh, one of two figures blocking the only exit to the street, their forms silhouetted against the lurid neon glow of a liquor store sign. Alistair Finch, a man who had once brought nations to their economic knees with a single phone call, a man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries, clutched his threadbare coat and said nothing. He had nothing. That was the whole point. The irony was so bitter, it almost made him laugh. A broken, gurgling sound that was mistaken for defiance. The shadow stepped closer, a boot lashing out and connecting with his shin. Pain, white-hot and absolute, shot up his leg. "Nothing to say? You're just a piece of trash, you know that? Taking up space." Then a small, clear voice cut through the grimy air like a bell. "Stop it! Leave him alone!" The two figures froze, turning toward the sound. A little girl stood at the mouth of the alley, no taller than a fire hydrant, her backpack adorned with a sparkly unicorn keychain. Her face, framed by messy pigtails, was a mask of fierce, righteous fury. She took a tiny, stomping step forward. "I said, stop hurting him." The two young men looked at each other, then at the girl, then back at the crumpled old man on the ground. The absurdity of the situation, a tiny child challenging them, seemed to break their vicious momentum. One of them snorted, a sound of contempt mixed with something that might have been surprise. "Beat it, kid! This ain't your business." But she didn't move. She stood her ground, her small fists clenched at her sides. "He's a person," she declared, her voice trembling but unwavering. "You can't just hurt people." For a moment, a tense silence hung in the alley, broken only by the distant wail of a siren. Alistair, propped on one elbow, watched the impossible standoff, a strange warmth spreading through his chest, chasing away the cold dread. The leader of the pair took a half step towards her, menacingly, but his friend grabbed his arm. "Come on, man, let's go. She's just a kid." The leader hesitated, shot one last disgusted look at Alistair, and then spat on the ground. "Whatever. He ain't got nothing anyway." With that, the two shadows detached from the entrance and swaggered off down the street, their laughter swallowed by the city's cacophony. The little girl watched them go, her shoulders stiff with defiance, until they rounded the corner. Only then did she relax, her whole body seeming to deflate. She turned her wide, concerned brown eyes on Alistair. She cautiously approached him, her worn sneakers scuffing on the grimy pavement. "Are you okay, mister?" Alistair tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of pain from his ribs made him gasp. He had orchestrated hostile takeovers, faced down federal investigators, and dismantled the careers of men far more powerful than these street toughs, yet he had been undone by a casual act of pointless violence, and saved by a child. He looked at her, really looked at her. She couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. Her coat was clean but frayed at the cuffs, and her jeans had a colorful patch on one knee. She was the picture of innocence in a place that had none. I think so," he rasped, his voice rough from disuse and the blow to his throat. "Thank you." The girl bit her lip, a gesture of deep concentration. They were being bullies. My mom says you should always stand up to bullies, even if you're scared. She then did something that stunned him more than the attack. She unzipped her unicorn backpack, rummaged inside, and pulled out a small, slightly squashed sandwich in a plastic bag and a shiny red apple. She held them out to him. "Here," she said, "you look hungry." Alistair stared at the offering. For the last 2 months, since he had walked away from his life, he had been invisible. People looked through him, around him, past him. He was part of the urban landscape, a piece of human debris to be ignored. He had been sneered at, cursed, and now beaten. But this child, this stranger, saw him. She saw a person. He slowly reached out a trembling hand, his fingers stained with the city's grime, closing around the apple. It felt heavy, substantial, a sphere of impossible kindness. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice thick. "Lily," she said, offering a small, shy smile. "My name is Lily." The world Alistair Finch had known was a place of contracts and clauses, of leverage and liabilities. Kindness was a weakness, a currency to be feigned, but never genuinely spent. Yet here it was, in its purest form, offered freely in a dark alley, with no expectation of return. He had set out on this insane quest to find one person of worth, one soul untainted by the greed that had defined his life and poisoned his own family. He thought he would be searching for months, maybe years, sifting through the dregs of humanity. He never imagined he would find her on day 57, in the form of a little girl, with a unicorn keychain, who thought he was worth her apple. He looked from the apple in his hand to the earnest face of the child before him, and for the first time in over 40 years, Alistair Finch felt a profound and terrifying flicker of hope. He took a slow, painful bite of the sandwich. It was simple: white bread, a single slice of cheese, a smear of mustard, but it was the most magnificent meal he'd ever eaten. It tasted of courage and compassion. Lily sat cross-legged on the ground a few feet away, watching him with an unnerving solemnity, as if she were supervising a delicate procedure. "My mom made it," she announced, as if that explained its quality. "She makes the best sandwiches." Alistair managed a nod, chewing slowly. The pain in his side was a constant, sharp reminder of his vulnerability. He was no longer insulated by layers of security, lawyers, and assistants. Here, on the street, he was just flesh and bone, and his bones were old. "Your mother. She's a good woman," he said, the words feeling inadequate. "She's a nurse," Lily said, puffing out her chest with pride. "She helps sick people get better. Sometimes she works at the hospital, and sometimes she works at the diner to make extra money for us. She gets really tired." The casual way she said it, the simple acceptance of a reality so harsh, struck Alistair. He owned 3 hospitals in this city alone, gleaming towers of glass and steel, where the wealthy paid fortunes for premium care. He'd never once considered the lives of the people who cleaned the floors or served the food, the ecosystem of exhaustion that kept his enterprises running. "You should go home, Lily," he said gently, finishing the last bite of the sandwich. "Your mother will be worried." Lily's face fell. "I'm supposed to go straight home from school. I take a shortcut through here sometimes because there are pretty cats that live in the dumpster. But Mom says it's not safe." She looked at him, her eyes wide. "I guess she's right." "She is," Alistair affirmed. "This is no place for a little girl." He held up the apple. "Thank you for this. You may have saved my life." He wasn't entirely sure it was an exaggeration. Lily beamed, the compliment erasing her momentary fear. "You're welcome. Do you have a home, mister?" The question was direct, without pity or judgment. It was a simple request for information. "Not right now," he answered honestly. "My name is Al," he added, using the abbreviated anonymous name he'd chosen for this new life. "It's nice to meet you, Mr. Al," she said formally, scrambling to her feet and brushing the dust from her patched jeans. "I have to go now. Mom will be mad if I'm late for dinner. We're having spaghetti." She hesitated for a moment, then added, "Will you be here tomorrow?" Alistair looked around the filthy alley, at the overflowing dumpsters and the graffiti-scarred walls. It was a miserable place, but the thought of seeing this child again, this small beacon of light, was a powerful lure. "I might be," he said. Lily nodded, satisfied. "Okay, bye, Mr. Al." And with a final wave, she was gone, her unicorn keychain bouncing as she ran out of the alley and back into the world of light and spaghetti dinners. Alistair was alone again, but the loneliness felt different. It was less of an abyss and more of a quiet space. He carefully polished the apple on his sleeve and took a bite. It was crisp, sweet, and perfect. He ate it slowly, core and all, not wanting to waste a single molecule of the kindness it represented. As darkness fell, and a cold rain began to slicken the pavement, he huddled deeper into his thin coat, the pain in his ribs a dull ache. He thought of his own children, Richard and Beatrice. He imagined them at that moment, likely in a lavishly appointed boardroom with his legal team, arguing over the provisional clauses of his will, their faces masks of performative grief concealing ravenous greed. They wouldn't be sharing their apples. They would be fighting over the entire orchard, the land it grew on, and the companies that transported the fruit. They would never think to look for him here, in the grime and the rain. They had never truly seen him, even when he was sitting across a dinner table from them. They saw only a vault, a key, a legacy to be claimed. But Lily had seen a hungry old man who was hurt. His quest had been born of cynicism, a bitter, last-ditch effort to prove that his entire life, his entire philosophy of human nature, was not the whole truth. He had wanted to find one person to prove his greedy, grasping children wrong. It was a search for an heir, not of blood, but of spirit. And in the space of 10 minutes, a little girl had shown him more humanity than he had witnessed in his boardroom in 30 years. He didn't know what would happen tomorrow, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would be in this alley. He had to see Lily again. The next day, the alley felt different. The morning sun, weak as it was, filtered down between the tall buildings, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The lingering stench of garbage was still there, but Alistair found he minded it less. He had spent the night in a nearby homeless shelter, a place of loud snores, coughing fits, and the palpable despair of broken men. It was his first time in such an establishment. He had purchased it 3 years ago as a tax write-off, a philanthropic gesture his PR team had spun into a week-long media event. Standing in the soup line, he'd recognized the portrait of himself on the wall, a smiling, benevolent-looking man in a $1,000 suit, hanging over the very people his real-world policies had helped displace. The hypocrisy was so thick he could taste it. He had left before dawn, needing the relative peace of his alley. He found a discarded piece of cardboard to sit on, insulating himself from the cold concrete, and waited. He felt a nervous anticipation he hadn't experienced since his very first corporate raid. What if she didn't come? What if her mother had forbidden the shortcut? What if yesterday was a fluke, a one-time alignment of the stars? The hours crawled by. The city hummed around him, a symphony of traffic, sirens, and shouting he was slowly learning to decipher. He watched people hurry past the alley's entrance, their faces set, their eyes focused on destinations and deadlines. Not one of them glanced his way. He was invisible again. Just after 3 o'clock, when a sliver of disappointment had begun to creep into his heart, he saw her. Lily slowed as she approached the alley, peering into the shadows with a hopeful caution. When she spotted him, her face broke into a radiant smile. "Mr. Al, you're here!" She skipped into the alley, her unicorn backpack bouncing. "I brought you something." She presented him with a small carton of milk and a cookie wrapped in a napkin. "It's oatmeal raisin," she said. "It was for my snack, but I saved it for you." Alistair accepted the offering with a reverence that would have baffled anyone who knew him. "Lily, you shouldn't give me your snack. You need it to grow." Lily shrugged, a gesture of profound 7-year-old wisdom. "It's okay. Mom says it's better to share than to have too much all for yourself." This simple platitude, spoken with such earnestness, was like a dagger in Alistair's chest. It was the antithesis of the gospel he had preached his entire life. Accumulate, dominate, acquire. Too much was never enough. He and Lily fell into an easy routine. Each weekday, she would appear with a small piece of her lunch or snack, a handful of crackers, a banana, a juice box. She would tell him about her day, the frustrations of learning long division, the triumph of winning a spelling bee, the drama of a playground squabble. She talked about her mother, Sarah, with a mixture of love and worry. "Mom's feet hurt a lot," she'd say, her brow furrowed. "She stands up all day at the diner. I wish I could buy her magic shoes." Alistair, in turn, found himself opening up in ways he never had before. He couldn't tell her the truth, of course, but he told her stories. He told her about growing up poor, a detail from his life he had long since buried under a mountain of wealth and a fabricated family history. He told her about a friend he once had, who got lost because he cared more about treasure than people. He was speaking about himself, weaving his confessions into cautionary tales, for a child who was already wiser than he'd ever been. He learned the cartography of her small world, the school 4 blocks away, the park with the broken swing, the library where she and her mom went on Saturdays. He also learned about the shadow that hung over it. The building she lived in, along with the entire block, had been sold. The new owners were some big, faceless corporation that was planning to tear everything down to build luxury condos. Eviction notices had been posted, their formal, threatening language a source of constant anxiety for the residents. "Mom is really worried," Lily confided one afternoon, her voice small. "She doesn't know where we'll go. The new apartments they're building are for rich people, not for us." Alistair felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He knew the name of the development project, the Finch Spire. It was his company. His son, Richard, was personally overseeing the acquisition and demolition. He was the faceless corporation. The irony was a physical blow, worse than the punches he'd taken in this very alley. He was about to make this child, his tiny, generous friend, homeless. He was the villain in her story. He looked at the half-eaten granola bar she had just given him and felt a surge of self-loathing so powerful it made him dizzy. "Don't you worry, Lily," he heard himself say, his voice a low growl. Maybe something will happen. Maybe the people building it will change their minds." Lily looked at him, her eyes full of a child's desperate hope. "Do you really think so, Mr. Al?" He had to look away, unable to meet her gaze. "Anything is possible," he whispered. That night the rain was relentless, and the shelter was full. Alistair found a meager awning to huddle under, his clothes soaked through, a deep, rattling cough starting in his chest. As he shivered in the dark, he thought not of his billions, but of magic shoes and a little girl's fear. He had come to the street to find an heir. Instead, he had found his own conscience, and it was a brutal, unforgiving thing. He had the power to save her, to save this entire community, with a single phone call. But to do that, Alistair Finch would have to come back from the dead. And if he did that, he would lose the one genuine human connection he had ever made. He would lose Lily. The cough racked his body, and as he drifted into a feverish, uneasy sleep, he realized he was trapped. Trapped not by poverty, but by a wealth so vast it had insulated him from the very consequences of its own creation. The cough settled deep in his lungs, a wet, persistent rattle that shook his frail frame. The cold nights on the street and the dampness that seemed to permeate everything were taking their toll. He was weaker, the dull ache in his ribs a constant companion. He knew he was sick, not just with a cold, but with something more serious. Pneumonia, perhaps. In his old life, a single sneeze would have summoned a team of the world's best physicians. Now, his only option was to wait in line at a free clinic, a prospect that felt more daunting than any boardroom battle. Lily noticed the change immediately. "You sound like a grumpy bear, Mr. Al," she said one afternoon, her head cocked to the side as he was seized by a coughing fit that left him breathless and dizzy. He tried to wave off her concern, but she was having none of it. Her brow was knitted with a seriousness that mirrored her mother's. The next day, she didn't come alone. Holding her hand was a tired-looking woman in nurse's scrubs, her blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun. Her face was etched with fatigue, but her eyes, the same warm brown as her daughter's, were sharp and intelligent. "So you're Mr. Al," she said, her tone neutral but observant. "I'm Sarah, Lily's mom." Alistair struggled to his feet, feeling a sudden, foolish need to make a good impression. He was acutely aware of his matted hair, his grimy clothes, the stench of the street that clung to him. "A pleasure to meet you, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice hoarse. "Lily talks about you all the time," Sarah continued, her gaze taking in his gaunt face and the feverish glint in his eyes. "She's been worried. She said you have a bad cough." Before he could reply, she stepped closer and pressed the back of her hand against his forehead. Her touch was cool and professional. "You're burning up. You need to see a doctor." "I'm fine," Alistair lied, a reflexive habit from a lifetime of never admitting weakness. "Just a cold." Sarah gave him a look that told him she saw through the lie with practiced ease. "That's not just a cold. That's a go-to-the-emergency-room cough. Come on." She took him by the arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Where are you taking me?" he asked, bewildered. "I'm taking you home," she said. as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Our apartment is small, but it's warm and dry. I have a nebulizer, and I can get you some antibiotics. You can't stay out here like this. You'll die. Alistair was speechless. This woman, who worked 2 jobs, who was facing eviction, who had every reason to be bitter and closed off from the world, was offering to take a filthy, sick, homeless man into her home, a home she shared with her young daughter. It was reckless. It was insane. It was the most profoundly decent thing anyone had ever done for him. I can't, he protested weakly. I couldn't impose. It's not an imposition. It's what you do, Sarah said, a faint hint of frustration in her voice. You see someone who needs help, and you help them. Lily, grab his other arm. Lily, her face a mask of solemn importance, did as she was told. Supported between the mother and daughter, Alistair allowed himself to be led out of the alley and into the light. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a walk-up building with peeling paint and worn carpets. The space inside was tiny, but it was immaculately clean and filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the clanking radiator in the corner. Drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a stack of library books sat on a small coffee table, and the air smelled faintly of cinnamon. It felt like a home. Sarah settled him on the worn-out sofa, piling blankets over him. She was a whirlwind of efficiency, taking his temperature, listening to his lungs with an old stethoscope, and barking gentle orders. Lily, her appointed assistant, brought him a glass of water and a bowl of chicken noodle soup that was, he discovered, even better than her sandwiches. For 3 days, Alistair drifted in a feverish haze. Sarah cared for him with a no-nonsense tenderness. She administered medication she'd procured from a doctor friend at the hospital, made sure he was hydrated, and checked on him throughout the night, even after her long shifts at the diner. Lily would sit by the couch and read to him from her favorite books, her soft voice a soothing balm on his weary soul. He learned the rhythm of their lives. The early morning rush to get ready for school and work, the quiet evenings of homework and shared meals, the soft murmur of Sarah reading Lily a bedtime story. He witnessed their struggles firsthand. A bill Sarah couldn't pay, a call from a landlord who was unsympathetic to their plight. But he also witnessed their resilience, their love, the unwavering bond that made their small, precarious world a fortress. In his clearer moments, Alistair was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of shame. He was living under the roof of the very people his company was preparing to cast out onto the street. He was accepting the charity of a woman whose financial hardship was a direct, albeit distant, consequence of his own insatiable ambition. He was a fraud, a wolf being nursed by the lambs he was hunting. One evening, as his fever finally broke, he was sitting up, sipping a cup of tea Sarah had made him. Lily was asleep in her small room, and the apartment was quiet. "I don't know how to thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice still weak, but clear for the first time in days. "You didn't have to do this." Sarah sat in the armchair opposite him, a mending basket in her lap. She looked exhausted, the lines around her eyes deeper in the soft lamplight. "My mother always said there are 2 kinds of people in the world," she said, not looking at him. "The kind who build longer tables, and the kind who build higher fences. It's not always easy, but I try to be the first kind." She finally met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Besides, Lily loves you. She thinks you're a king in disguise, like in her fairy tales." Alistair's heart clenched. A king in disguise. If only she knew how close to the truth that was, and how twisted. "She's a remarkable child," he said softly. "You've done a wonderful job raising her." A sad smile touched Sarah's lips. "I just try to make sure she holds on to her kindness. This world does its best to beat it out of you." She looked at the eviction notice that was held to the refrigerator by a smiling sun magnet Lily had made. "Looks like it's winning this round." Alistair looked at the notice, then at this tired, decent woman who had shown him more grace than he deserved. The trap he was in no longer felt abstract. It was here, in this warm, small room. The choice was no longer about a nameless, faceless community. It was about Sarah and Lily. The gears in his mind, dormant for months, began to turn. The ruthless, strategic mind of Alistair Finch began to whir back to life. But this time, its objective was different. It wasn't about acquisition or profit. It was about justice. It was about building a longer table. He knew what he had to do. He would have to blow up his entire world, expose his family's greed, and face the consequences of his own deception. But he would not let their home be taken. He would not let this light be extinguished. "Sarah," he began, his voice taking on a new tone, a hint of the authority he had long kept hidden. "What if I told you there was a way to fight this? A way to save this building?" Sarah looked at him, a flicker of confused hope in her tired eyes. "How? We've tried everything. We're just little people, and they're a giant." Alistair Finch met her gaze, the last vestiges of the pathetic, helpless owl falling away from him like a snake's shed skin. "Every giant," he said, a cold, hard fire igniting in his eyes, "has a weakness." His strength returned slowly, but his resolve was iron. For the next week he became a quiet observer in their home, a ghost at the periphery of their lives, all while his mind worked furiously. He listened. He learned the names of their neighbors. Mr. Henderson, the retired widower on the first floor who fed the pigeons. The Ramirez family in 2B, with 3 noisy kids, and a 4th on the way. Ms. Gable, the music teacher who gave Lily free piano lessons on an old, out-of-tune upright. This wasn't just a building. It was a vertical village, a fragile ecosystem of interconnected lives, all under threat from his own son. From his throne of blankets on the sofa, Alistair began to formulate a plan. It was a classic Finch strategy. Gather intelligence, identify the opponent's weakness, and apply overwhelming force at the precise point of vulnerability. The opponent was Finch Enterprises and its CEO, Richard Finch. The weakness was Richard's vanity and his desperate need for public approval. And the force? The force would be the truth. He needed a conduit to his old life. One person he knew he could trust. Arthur Pendleton, his lawyer for over 40 years. Arthur was the only one who knew of Alistair's boating accident and the real reason behind his disappearance. He was the executor of a complex set of instructions to be followed in the event of Alistair's re-emergence. The problem was communication. Alistair had no phone, no money, no way to contact him without revealing himself. The solution came in the form of Lily's weekly trip to the library. "Mr. Al, are you feeling better enough to come with us?" she asked one Saturday morning, her eyes shining with excitement. "We can find books about grumpy bears who get better." Sarah, seeing his improved health and the fresh air he needed, agreed. The public library was a sanctuary of quiet and knowledge. While Lily and Sarah browsed the children's section, Alistair made his way to the public computers. His hands trembled slightly as he typed in the familiar web address for a secure, encrypted messaging service he and Arthur had used for decades. He entered his old credentials, half expecting them to be defunct. Access granted. His heart hammered against his ribs. He typed a short, simple message. The Minotaur is in the labyrinth. I have found the thread. Prepare the Athenian ships. Code Echo 7. It was a message Arthur would understand instantly. The Minotaur was Richard. The labyrinth was the redevelopment project. The Athenian ships were the full, unrestrained legal and media resources of Alistair's private holding company. And Code Echo 7 was the most important part. Execute the Lazarus Protocol. Come back from the dead. He hit send and quickly cleared his history, his reflection in the dark screen showing a haggard old man with fierce, determined eyes. He rejoined Sarah and Lily, his mind buzzing. The first domino had been pushed. The next few days were a strange, liminal existence. He was still Mr. Al, the kind homeless man Lily had rescued. He helped Sarah with groceries, told Lily bedtime stories he invented on the spot, and listened to Mr. Henderson's long-winded tales about the war. He was part of their world. Yet, simultaneously, he was Alistair Finch, the puppet master, waiting for his pieces to move into place. He saw news reports on the library computer about sudden, inexplicable volatility in Finch Enterprises stock. He read articles quoting anonymous sources from within the company expressing deep concern over the aggressive and ethically questionable tactics of the Finch Spire project. He saw the first cracks appearing in Richard's carefully constructed public image. The Athenian ships were sailing. The final eviction date was set for the following Monday. A grim mood had fallen over the building. On Sunday, the residents held a small, hopeless gathering in the dingy lobby. Sarah brought a casserole. Mr. Henderson brought a bottle of cheap wine. They talked in hushed, defeated tones about where they would go, how they would manage. Alistair stood in the corner, watching the faces of the people he had come to know. He saw their fear, their quiet dignity in the face of ruin, and he felt a righteous anger, a cold fury he hadn't felt in years. This was the human cost of his empire, a cost he had never bothered to calculate. Lily, sensing the oppressive sadness, tugged on his sleeve. "Are they going to make us leave tomorrow, Mr. Al?" she whispered, her eyes welling with tears. He knelt down, putting his hands on her small shoulders. He looked directly into her eyes. "No, Lily," he said, his voice imbued with a certainty that seemed to come from another world. "Tomorrow, the king is going to come back, and he's going to fix everything." Lily's eyes widened. "The king in disguise?" He allowed himself a small, sad smile. Something like that. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat on the sofa in the dark, listening to the quiet breathing of the two people who had saved him. He was about to shatter their world, to change their lives in ways they couldn't possibly imagine. He was giving them security, a future. But he was also taking something away. He was taking away the simple, uncomplicated kindness they had shown to a nameless, worthless old man. Tomorrow, he would be Alistair Finch again, a name synonymous with power and wealth and everything they weren't. He didn't know if their friendship could survive the revelation. He was about to save them, but he was afraid he might lose them in the process. Monday morning dawned gray and oppressive. A large, formidable-looking man in a cheap suit, flanked by two uniformed security guards, began knocking on doors at precisely 9 o'clock. He was the herald of their displacement, his clipboard a scepter of doom. When he knocked on Sarah's door, Alistair was the one who answered. The man looked at the disheveled old man with contempt. "Final notice. You have until 5 p.m. to vacate the premises. All remaining personal effects will be disposed of." Sarah stood behind Alistair, Lily clutching her leg, her face pale. "We need more time," Sarah pleaded. "We have nowhere to go." The man just shrugged, a gesture of practiced indifference. "Not my problem. Talk to the owners." And as he turned to leave, a sleek black town car pulled up to the curb. The door opened, and a man in a perfectly tailored Savile Row suit stepped out. He was older, with a mane of white hair and a sharp, intelligent face. He carried a leather briefcase. It was Arthur Pendleton. Arthur's eyes scanned the dilapidated building, a flicker of distaste crossing his features before he composed himself. He walked past the eviction agent as if he were a piece of furniture and stopped in front of Alistair. For a moment, the two old friends simply looked at each other. Arthur's gaze took in the ragged clothes, the unkempt beard, the raw weariness in Alistair's eyes. A universe of unspoken understanding passed between them. "It's time, Alistair," Arthur said softly, his voice for Alistair's ears alone. "Everything is in place." The eviction agent, recognizing a man of immense wealth and power, stopped in his tracks. "Sir, this is a private matter. These tenants need to—" Arthur cut him off with a glacial stare. "These tenants are under the protection of Mr. Finch. You and your men will leave the premises. Now." The man's jaw dropped. "Mr. Finch? But I work for Mr. Finch. Richard Finch." "You work for Finch Enterprises," Arthur corrected him coldly, "and I am here to inform you, as lead counsel for its majority shareholder, that the Finch Spire project has been terminated, effective immediately. Your services are no longer required." He handed the bewildered man a crisp legal document. The man stared at it, his face turning ashen. Without another word, he and his guards scurried away. The lobby, which had been filled with the sounds of weeping and quiet despair, fell silent. The residents who had gathered on the landing stared, dumbfounded. Sarah looked from Arthur to Alistair, her face a canvas of confusion. What just happened? Who are you?" Before Alistair could answer, a second car, a gaudy sports car this time, screeched to a halt behind the first. Richard Finch stormed out, his face purple with rage. He was a younger, softer version of Alistair, with none of the father's flint, but all of his arrogance. He was on the phone, screaming. "What do you mean terminated? I gave the order. I'm in charge here." He spotted Arthur and marched towards him. "Pendleton, what is the meaning of this? You have no authority to countermand my orders." Arthur simply stepped aside, revealing Alistair, who stood there, frail but resolute, on the top step of the brownstone. Richard stopped dead. His face went from purple to a ghostly white. The phone slipped from his fingers and clattered on the pavement. "Father," he whispered, his voice cracking, "but you're dead. We buried you." "You buried an empty casket, Richard," Alistair said, his voice no longer the hoarse whisper of Al, but the familiar, resonant baritone that had commanded boardrooms for decades. It echoed in the sudden, profound silence of the street. "I wanted to see what my children would do with my legacy. And you, my son, did not disappoint. You chose to build monuments of greed on the homes of good people." He gestured to the building, to Sarah and Lily, who were watching, wide-eyed and trembling, from the doorway. He looked at the other residents, at Mr. Henderson and the Ramirez family, who were peering out their windows in shock. His gaze returned to Richard, and it was as cold and hard as granite. "You are a disgrace to the name. As of this moment, you are removed as CEO of Finch Enterprises. You are removed from the board. You are removed from my will. You are, for all intents and purposes, disinherited." Richard sputtered, his arrogance collapsing into a pathetic whimper. "You can't—" "The board. The shareholders." "The board serves at my pleasure," Alistair snapped. "And I own 54% of the voting stock. The empire you thought was yours has always been, and will always be mine. Now get off this property." Defeated, humiliated, Richard stumbled back to his car and sped away, leaving a trail of burning rubber and shattered entitlement. The street was quiet again. All eyes were on Alistair. He felt 100 pairs of eyes on him, but he only saw 2. He turned to face Sarah and Lily. He saw the shock, the disbelief, the hurt confusion in Sarah's eyes. He saw the wonder, and a dawning, heartbreaking fear in Lily's. He slowly walked towards them, his old life settling back onto his shoulders like a heavy, familiar coat. He stopped a few feet from them. The distance felt like a chasm. "The king in disguise," Sarah whispered, the words a hollow echo of her daughter's fairy tale. "Is that what this was? Some kind of game for you? A test?" The accusation in her voice was sharper than any physical blow he had endured. "No," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "It started as a test, but it became a lesson. You and your daughter. You taught me something I had spent a lifetime trying to ignore. You taught me about kindness, about decency." He knelt down, so he was on eye level with Lily. The little girl, who had stood up to bullies for him, who had shared her lunch with him, who had read to him when he was sick. She looked at him now as if he were a stranger, her small face filled with confusion. "Lily," he said softly, "I am so sorry I lied to you. But the friendship we had, that was real. Mr. Al was real. What you did for me, it was the kindest thing anyone has ever done." He reached into the pocket of his tattered coat and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird. He had bought it for a few cents from another man on the street a week ago, and had spent his nights carefully sanding and polishing it. He held it out to her. "I wanted to give you this," he said, "to thank you." Lily looked at the bird, then at his face, her lip trembling. She didn't take the gift. Instead, she burst into tears and buried her face in her mother's coat. The sound of her crying shattered Alistair's composure more than anything else that day. He had won. He had saved their home, defeated his son, reclaimed his empire. But in the process, he had broken the heart of the one person in the world whose opinion of him truly mattered. He had found his heir, but he feared he had lost his friend. Arthur placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Alistair, we have much to do." Alistair stood up, his old bones aching. He looked at the small crying child and her mother, who held her tightly, staring at him with a mixture of anger and betrayal. He had made the right choice, he knew, but it didn't feel like a victory. The days that followed were a whirlwind of orchestrated chaos. Alistair Finch's return from the dead was the biggest news story of the decade. The media frenzy was relentless. Finch Enterprises stock soared on the news of his return, and the subsequent ousting of Richard. Alistair, now clean-shaven, impeccably dressed and looking 10 years younger, was once again the formidable titan of industry. He moved back into his cavernous penthouse overlooking the city, a sterile glass box that felt more alien than Sarah's tiny, warm apartment. From this command center, he and Arthur worked relentlessly to dismantle the legacy of his own greed. He didn't just cancel the Finch Spire project. He transferred ownership of the entire block of buildings to a newly created housing trust, managed by a non-profit organization. He made the trust's first official act, a declaration that the current residents could remain in their homes indefinitely, with their rents frozen at their current rates. He established a multi-billion-dollar foundation, the largest of its kind in the world. But it wasn't named the Finch Foundation. He named it the Lily Foundation. Its charter was simple: to provide housing, health care, and educational opportunities for the city's most vulnerable. Its guiding principle was Sarah's philosophy: to build longer tables, not higher fences. He tried to see them. He sent a car. It was politely, but firmly, sent away. He called, but Sarah wouldn't pick up the phone. He understood her reluctance, her distrust. He had entered their lives under a false pretense, a benevolent lie that had become a staggering, world-altering truth. How could they trust him? What did he want from them? He had offered Sarah a position on the board of the foundation with a generous salary that would mean she would never have to work another double shift at the diner. She had refused. He had set up a trust for Lily that would guarantee her education at any university in the world. Sarah had not yet touched it. He had all the power in the world, but he couldn't fix the one thing he had broken. A week after his return, he went back to the alley. It was just an alley again, dirty, empty, smelling of garbage. It held no magic, no memory of the little girl who had faced down bullies. It was just a place of grime and shadows. As he stood there, a familiar figure appeared at the far end. It was Mr. Henderson, scattering breadcrumbs for a flock of pigeons. The old man looked up and saw him. He didn't see a billionaire. He saw the man who had sat with him in the lobby and listened to his stories. "Heard you came into some money," Mr. Henderson said, his eyes twinkling. Alistair smiled faintly. "You could say that." "Good for you," the old man said with a nod. "You know, that little Lily, she asks about her friend, Mr. Al, all the time. She misses him." The words were a gut punch. She didn't miss Alistair Finch. She missed the grumpy, coughing old man who told her stories about bears. Armed with this knowledge, he tried a different approach. He shed the suit and the armor of his wealth. He put on a simple pair of trousers and a sweater. He walked, without security or a driver, the 6 blocks from his gleaming tower to their walk-up building. He didn't go to their door. He just sat on the front steps, the same steps he had climbed, weak and feverish, just weeks before. He sat there for an hour, then 2. People from the building passed him, nodding shyly, whispering his name. He just waited. Finally, the door opened. It was Sarah. She held a bag of groceries, and her face was weary. She stopped when she saw him. "What are you doing here, Mr. Finch?" she asked, her voice strained. "My name is Alistair," he said quietly, "and I'm waiting for a friend." He looked past her, up the stairs. "Is Lily home?" Sarah hesitated, her expression a mixture of protection and uncertainty. "She's doing her homework. Could I speak with her? Please. I won't stay long." Sarah studied his face, searching for the trick, the angle, but she saw none. She saw only an old, lonely man. With a deep sigh, she nodded and held the door open. He followed her up the 3 flights of stairs, his heart pounding. Lily was at the small kitchen table, a textbook open, a half-eaten apple beside it. She looked up when he entered, and her eyes widened. She didn't run. She just stared. Alistair stopped in the doorway, feeling like an intruder. "Hello, Lily," he said softly. She didn't answer. She just looked at him, at his clean clothes and his neat hair. "Your mom told me you've been asking for Mr. Al," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Well, he's here. He had to put on a costume for a while. But he's back now." He slowly walked to the table and sat down in the chair opposite her. He looked at her half-eaten apple. "Is that for me?" he asked, a hopeful tremor in his voice. Lily looked at the apple, then back at him. A long silent moment passed. Then slowly she pushed the apple across the table towards him. A single tear-filled, forgiving smile bloomed on her face. "Hi, Mr. Al," she whispered. In that moment, Alistair Finch felt a sense of peace that all his billions could never buy. He had found his heir. He had found his purpose. But more than that, in a tiny apartment above a noisy city street, he had finally, after a lifetime of searching, found a home. He spent his remaining months not as a titan, but as a grandfather. The terminal diagnosis his doctors had given him hadn't changed, but his life had. He didn't spend his days in boardrooms. He spent them in the park, pushing Lily on the swing he'd had fixed. He didn't pore over stock reports. He helped Lily with her long division. He, Sarah, and Lily became a strange, unlikely family. Sarah eventually accepted the position on the Foundation's board, where her compassion and first-hand experience became its most valuable asset. Alistair taught her about finance and leverage, and she taught him about humanity and grace. When he passed away, it wasn't in a cold hospital bed surrounded by beeping machines, but on the worn-out sofa in Sarah's living room, with Lily asleep on his chest and Sarah reading a book nearby. His death was peaceful, and he was not alone. Years later, a young woman stood at a podium, dedicating the newest and largest homeless shelter in the city. It was a state-of-the-art facility, offering not just beds, but medical care, job training, and permanent housing solutions. The woman was poised, eloquent, and her eyes shone with a familiar warmth and intelligence. Many people see the name of our foundation and assume it was named for me, Lily Finch, now a university graduate, told the assembled crowd. But they're wrong. It was named in honor of the spirit of a little girl who once shared her lunch with a cold and hungry old man in an alley. That man's name was Mr. Al. He taught me that you don't have to be a billionaire to change the world. Sometimes all it takes is an apple. All it takes is seeing the person everyone else pretends is invisible. The greatest legacy we can leave isn't money, it's kindness. In the front row, Sarah watched her daughter, her heart full of a quiet, fierce pride. The legacy was secure. The table had been built long indeed.